Alright, so what I have today is I have a few opening thoughts on the Stoa 2013-2014 LD topic, resolved. The United States has a moral obligation to mitigate international conflicts. I'm going to talk a little bit about how I think the topic will be interpreted, what I think the straight up the middle affirmative approach will be, a few other affirmative approaches that have some potential, and then some thoughts on the negative. Now, this is all very preliminary, and there'll be more this summer with suggested readings, crackpot ideas, but this is just to break ground. So, to begin with, mitigate. Mitigate means to reduce the severity or the damage. International conflict, there's a little bit of slippage there. It's possible that someone might find it within their strategic interests during the year to define international disputes as conflict. You'll find there's a lot of social science literature that says that wherever there are incompatible goals, perception of scarce resources, there's conflict. But I think that most of the time people will talk about it as armed conflict, and I think you could sketch out a pretty compelling argument that this topic is about a certain contained controversy that does suggest armed conflict, and that ought to be the affirmative's burden. I don't know. It depends on your judging pool whether that's an argument that really flies, whether you could take an affirmative that really was just dealing with trade disputes or some other kind of dispute and say that that didn't fall within the ambit of the topic. I have seen a couple of writings that said when you're talking about sports, when you're talking about economic disputes where they don't actually argue about the rules themselves, then that's not a conflict, that's a competition. And you might be able to find some support for that or propose that as a distinction that narrows the topic a little bit. My hope is that most of the time people will stick to the idea of armed conflict because that does get you to a fairly compact little body of literature. The other kind of interesting twist to the topic is that it doesn't say that the United States has a moral obligation to mitigate its armed conflicts. So, in theory, you're not limited to armed conflicts in which the United States was a participant. But that, I think, is kind of self-checking because you have to stretch awfully hard to be able to think of a situation where it's in the affirmative strategic interests to try to win the argument that the United States has a moral obligation to provide humanitarian assistance or whatever other kind of assistance to mitigate conflicts between other nations that it had no part of. So while that's a possible interpretation, it's not an interpretation that I expect you'll see. Now, one of the first things that has to happen on just about every new Lincoln Douglas topic is you got to give some thought to what is the affirmative's burden going to be. And there's almost always a spectrum with, at one endpoint, what's the ideal interpretation of the affirmative's burden for the negative, what's the highest burden possible, and then what's the ideal interpretation of the affirmative's burden for the affirmative, what's the lowest burden possible. And I think that I would describe them this way. I would say what would be best for the negative would be that the affirmative has to prove that the United States has a moral obligation to do the least damage possible to anybody in any international conflict situation. And then for the affirmative, I think that they could say all they had to prove was that the United States had a moral obligation to use less than the full range of military options available in any particular international conflict situation. And of course, you'll have to start hammering out what are your arguments. Well, actually, where would you peg the affirmative's burden between the two? Because if you go to either extreme, you come off sounding pretty unreasonable. So when you, for each side of the topic, are prepared to tell the judge what you think the affirmative's burden ought to be, you're going to want to have thought through. This is a reasonable burden because this is something that provides both of us out the gate an equal chance to win. And probably I would say while you are reading through a lot of the literature that I'm about to start talking about, you'll find some tests. You'll find some, multi-pronged tests. You'll find some ways of describing what it is. Some threshold tests is the word I was blanking on for a moment. Some threshold tests that determine whether some of these principles have been met or not. And you can use some of them as your way of delineating what the affirmative's burden is. All right, a couple of concepts that are not in the topic but are desperately in need of being defined. The principles of just war. Now, the principles of just war are divided into three categories, and I think the first one has very little to do with your topic. Jus ad bellum. Jus ad bellum, which you spell J-U-S, second word A-D, third word B-E-L-L-U-M, is the law of when is it just to go to war? When is it just to begin a war? When is it just to fight back? And some people say that there is a jus ad bellum controversy over the United States 2003 invasion of Iraq, because President Bush made the argument that Iraq had weapons of mass destruction that were threatening the world, and therefore the United States was justified in undertaking a preemptive attack to neutralize that threat. And other people said that it was an aggressive war and a war of convenience, a war that the United States did not have to begin and was therefore an unjust war. That whole question, are you justified in fighting the war in the first place, is jus ad bellum. Now the second category is jus in bello. So J-U-S, second word I-N, third word B-E-L-L-O. The just war as the war is conducted. What sorts of things are military organizations allowed to do while the war is underway? And there are two principles primarily that govern just war. And those two principles are proportionality and discrimination. Proportionality is, are you using force that is roughly comparable to the scale of the threat? So back in 1983, when Ronald Reagan was president of the United States, he sent in a few United States troops into the island nation of Grenada because there was, I haven't even looked up the details of this, it's something you might want to read up on, but there were some United States medical students that were there, and there was a threat of some sort to them, and so he just sent in a few soldiers and they took over the island. Then in 2003, the invasion of Iraq, I've just mentioned, there was an air war, there was a ground invasion, and it was a much bigger scale military operation than would have been the case in Grenada. So if Reagan had sent in tanks and had bombed Grenada, there would have been a pretty reasonable argument that that was not proportional. And then back during the Cold War, my entire childhood, before the fall of the Soviet Union, the United States and the Soviet Union had intercontinental ballistic missiles targeted at one another because if either one launched a first strike, the other was going to retaliate. So if the Soviet Union had launched a full-scale first strike of nuclear-tipped intercontinental ballistic missiles, we would be justified, arguably, and it would be proportional for us to launch our intercontinental ballistic missiles and to wipe out their entire nation. But if the United States had used its intercontinental ballistic missiles on Grenada, or even on Iraq, that would not have been proportional. So, one of the things that we have to do is to be in compliance with jus in bello, the principle of jus in bello. If our use of force is proportional, it has to be roughly comparable to the scale of the threat. You might think of it like sometimes when someone kills another person and law enforcement hauls them in and their defense is self-defense, so they were under attack. One of the principles that goes into working all that out is, did they use reasonable force? So if someone is coming at you with a gun and you've got a gun, then if you shoot them to stop that threat, that's probably reasonable force. On the other hand, if someone comes up and just slaps you upside the head and you pull out a gun and shoot them, then that's not proportional. That's not using reasonable force. The second principle of jus in bello is a principle of discrimination. And when you hear talk about non-combatants and when you hear talk about collateral damage, they're talking about the principle of discrimination, which is to say, you're only supposed to fight with the other army. You're not supposed to fight with innocent bystanders. So if the army that you're fighting against is based in a city, then you shouldn't be shelling elementary schools and shelling hospitals. You should be finding legitimate military targets and limiting your strikes to those particular locations. So, I think probably the simplest affirmative, the most vanilla, boring affirmative you could have for your first practice debates would be to identify those two principles and say that they rise to the level of a moral obligation. And you say that by saying that conducting warfare outside the principles of jus in bello is effectively carrying out organized murder, and murder is immoral. And that answers the question, is there a moral obligation to comply, to adhere with the principles of jus in bello, to keep your warfare proportional and to discriminate between combatants and non-combatants? Yes, it's a moral obligation because failure to do so is murder. Simple answer to the question. Now, of course, there are some negative positions that can make that kind of problematic, and I'll get to that in a minute. But first I want to talk about some other possible affirmative approaches to the topic, because my hope is nobody would keep the topic, their affirmative, quite that vanilla, or it would be a really boring topic to debate. So here are a couple of angles I think you could take. I think that you could talk about the United States' refusal to sign the Landmine Treaty, because you'll find plenty written about how landmines don't discriminate. Because once you put landmines in the ground, if a kid comes along chasing baseball into the field and the landmine blows off the kid's limb, then you've just violated the principle of discrimination. And the United States is one of the only nations left in the world, there's just a handful of them, that are not signatories to the Landmine Treaty. And you'll even find in that literature that there's a fairly developed argument why the United States has a moral obligation to exercise its position as a leader to go ahead and sign the treaty. So I think that could be the sort of application which a lot has already been written about, and you could find some really good details and some really kind of sad stories and so forth to make your persuasive appeal vivid. Something similar to that people will be, I think, less familiar with is the problem of unexploded ordnance in Laos. During the Vietnam War, the United States dropped a lot of cluster bombs on the country of Laos, which is spelled Laos. Well, you extempers probably know that. But a lot of the unexploded ordnance is still there. And the United States, since the late 1990s, has been providing more and more support to Laos to try to clear it. But even as of May of this year, every province in Laos still has an unexploded ordnance problem, and a quarter of the villages report they still have regular casualties from unexploded ordnance. And of course, because this is a value topic, you don't have to have a plan to solve the problem. You just have to establish that the United States has a moral obligation to continue to assist Laos in clearing its unexploded ordnance. And that's a way to put a little bit of flesh on the bones of an affirmative having to do with discrimination. Well, and actually, I guess kind of an interesting angle that the negative could go on that would be to say the real question was jus ad bellum, because Laos was not a combatant nation in the first place. It was an undeclared war, so they could say, I'm drifting. At any rate, these are things that you can do a little looking into, a little reading up on, and that could be an angle to take on the topic. Another one that I think you'll find is that there's a lot being written about new kinds of weapons and new tactics being used in the war on terror. So as you read up on drones, as you read up on use of robots on the battlefield, as you read up on things like active denial systems, which are non-lethal weapons, you can just point them at someone, and I believe they use microwave radiation. They just induce pain. And they can be used in urban settings where there are belligerents, there are fighters for the opposing force, but there are also civilians in the crowd, because you can just turn it on the crowd and it makes them all hurt. And as soon as they run away, the hurting stops. And so it's defended as a more humane way to scatter a crowd. But there are people who are saying that there are jus in bello questions, troubling jus in bello questions that are being raised by these new particular technologies. Then there's also Guantanamo Bay and special rendition and secret interrogations around the world and detaining people based on secret evidence that they're not allowed to challenge. You could claim all of those are violations of jus in bello, and that the United States is behaving immorally by detaining people, many of whom were not necessarily belligerents in the combat zones from which they were taken in the first place. So you'll want to do some reading up on that, because that I think will turn into a whole area of applications of this principle. Then, if you want to start to get a little bit radical, I think you could do some reading up on the United States' role as an arms exporter. And here's the place where the fact that the topic does not say the United States has a moral obligation to mitigate its international conflicts could become a little bit useful, because the United States leads the world in its arms exports. And you can find some good articles written here and there that talk about some of the moral problems with that, and how if the United States was not such an endless supplier of advanced military technology. There was even one article I was looking at earlier today that said just research into new weapon systems was itself immoral. And I think that you could construct a sort of an affirmative that took a different direction and said the United States' real moral obligation is to stop supplying combatants around the world with weapons that can kill more and more people more and more efficiently. And if you can construct the moral backing behind that argument, then that could be a pretty interesting way into the debate. There's also, I mentioned jus ad bellum and jus in bello, but the third category I kind of got to talking about the topic and didn't get to the third one, jus post bellum. Jus post bellum is the law of what your obligations are after war. And very often, I mean, I think you could say that the unexploded ordnance in Laos, that falls to a certain extent under jus post bellum. So it's kind of a trifecta. It's all three of them. But you could say And you could find quite a bit written backing up this position that the United States actually ought to accede to and become a signatory to and cooperate with the International Criminal Court. Now that's a dangerous angle to take because there's a good deal written on the other side. So you'd be walking into kind of a hornet's nest. You would only want that to be your affirmative if you were very, very prepared to take that debate, because a lot of negatives would be prepared. I may be saying that this is more something you ought to have on your list to be prepared for on the negative, because it is a coherent approach to the topic. You could even go so far as to say that there are American officials that should be handed over to the International Criminal Court. You'll find people who defend the idea that all of the following people are war criminals. Henry Kissinger, for a lot of the decisions he signed off on during the Vietnam War, and also Donald Rumsfeld, and also Dick Cheney and George W. Bush. And so someone could take the angle that the United States should be prepared to give up its own leaders as a way of upholding the principle of jus post bellum, as a way of mitigating international conflict. We can't make right the decisions they made that violated the laws of war, but at least we can make sure that they didn't make those decisions with impunity. And I think that's probably one that's inflammatory enough that it's not one that I think is necessarily that great of an idea. But it's something that'll be out there, and it's something someone might try to wrongfoot you with. Okay, so I've said before that I'm going to come back with some suggested readings and so forth, but there's one that I'm going to put on the bottom of this list right now, because we came across this article, and it's really kind of an interesting read. It is by a scholar whose name is Janice, Janice. Her middle name is Gross, like 144, Gross, and her last name is Stein, Stein. And the title of her article is Psychological Explanations of International Conflict. And then what she does is she talks about certain heuristics and certain decision-making patterns and certain specific kinds of groupthink. And as you read this essay, you can Google it and it comes right up. It's a PDF. She has it posted on her own website. It's a chapter from a SAGE manual on international conflict. And what she does is she uses a lot of the language of the topic, because she says, these are the drivers of international conflict, and here are the ways to mitigate them. And then, what a lot of them do, a lot of them talk about things like the construction of an enemy and the stereotyping of an enemy, and you could go back and talk about some of the stereotyping, for example, that happened during World War II, and some of the images and some of the ideas that the United States and its propaganda spread about the Japanese. That resulted in the Japanese internment. That resulted in some really, really ugly Japanese propaganda posters where you have the yellow-skinned, buck-toothed, you have pictures of Japanese people referred to as monkeys. Some of this stuff that's really kind of loathsome. And I think you could say that the United States, when it is a participant in international conflict, has a moral imperative not to dehumanize the entire race of people who are our opponents. And you could even say that since the group of people right now that arguably is the most hostile to the United States is from the Middle East, that there's a great temptation to do that, and there are even signs of doing it. And you could use Janice Gross Stein's framework and say that really our obligation is to mitigate this by, as we engage in international conflict, reminding ourselves that our opponents are still humans. So the last thing I want to say in talking about the affirmative is to talk about which values, I think. I think if you're going to talk about just war theory, then a lot of people are going to talk about justice, and they're going to say that if the United States is in compliance with jus in bello, then that best achieves justice. And, there's a little bit of slippage there, but it's reasonable. I think that another one that you're going to hear a lot is the value of life. I mean, it's international conflict. Unless people are taking the digression of trying to talk about international disputes, very often I think the value will be life, and they'll try to say that that trumps everything else, and that's a debate you have over and over again in Lincoln Douglas. I think that you could also talk about not harming the innocent unnecessarily, that is one of the most bedrock values of all, that your behavior is worthy of judgment when it hurts those who are innocent. And really what the core of this topic is about is not hurting those who are innocent, and that's a moral obligation, and recognizing it's a moral obligation best achieves that value. And that could be kind of rhetorically appealing. And then The one for the Janus Gross-Stein approach, talking about the schemata and the heuristics, I think with that one you could say that your value is human dignity. Human dignity understood as sort of the negation, sort of as the positive virtue that is the converse of racism. And in particular, not just everyday racism, I'm from a out-of-the-way part of the country and I have parents who brought me up a certain way, but the particular brand of racism that shows up in the middle of international conflict. And you can find a good deal written not just about the United States and the Japanese, but all around the world. This is something that nations tend to do to their opponents. And I think you can find that there's a good deal written about this as a particular species, and a particularly pernicious and violent species of racism. Okay, so that's what I have to say about the affirmative, and here are some things to say about the negative. The first thing to say, I think that very often the value, while we're talking about values, the value I think you'll hear the most often from negatives is national security and or national survival, and that gets to the first argument that I think you'll hear a lot of the time, that the United States is not a moral agent, because the United States it's a government. It might be the case that certain officials, certain leaders within the United States, that they have moral obligations, but the political entity, the United States, does not have moral obligations. If it has any obligation at all, it is a functional obligation, and the functional obligation is to safeguard the security of its own members. Now you could, as the affirmative, say, well, one of the reasons that we uphold the jus in bello principles is because that does uphold the safety of our own soldiers when they're captured. So you can kind of turn that argument on its head. A couple of other angles I think you could take is, I think you could talk about how the affirmative is idealistic, and you could mount a strong defense of realism, that in the international realm, it really is a condition of anarchy, that principles are not there to be enforced, and where people have different cultures and different value premises, it's only meaningful to talk about moral obligations when you are having that conversation between members of a community who agree on certain first principles. And because that's not true in the realm of international relations, it's really kind of hopelessly naive to talk about things like moral obligations. A second approach I think you could take goes all the way in the other direction, and I think maybe you could get a fair amount of mileage, because it can be a very rhetorically appealing stance just out of philosophical nonviolence. You could say that the United States' real moral obligation, and everybody's real moral obligation, is to adopt a stance of nonviolence. And the idea of mitigating conflict, that's just a whitewash. That really is just putting a Band-Aid on a systemic problem. It's like saying that slave owners who own slaves, instead of using big whips, should use small whips that don't hurt as much, when the real, only acceptable, only morally tolerable answer to slavery is to abolish slavery. You may be able to take the position that the real, only morally tolerable response to armed conflict is to abolish armed conflict. And there's a good deal written, there's a very, very appealing literature that you can go to answer all the arguments about how, that's naive, that just gives the power to the people who would do us harm. And you can say that violence is a cycle, and that when one nation or one group becomes more powerful, all it does is give others an incentive to build up their power. That's how arms races start. The few times over the years that I've had my debaters get really deep on a defense of nonviolence, it didn't work every round. It usually wound up being a pretty severe throwdown, which is kind of violent language. But it was actually kind of a very thought-provoking, very satisfying debate to have, and to see exactly how they could put it into words. So that's one that you might have a look at. It's not one that I think is going to win you a lot of debates if you use it all the time, but it's one that I think I would have along, because you might find yourself in some debates where your usual tactics wouldn't work, and a strong defense of nonviolence could be kind of a Hail Mary for a debate in which you feel a little bit cornered. What I think you'll hear a lot is, I think you'll hear that the nature of war is changing. I think you'll hear a lot about Vietnam-style guerrilla war. I think you'll hear a lot about, we've already mentioned terrorism and talking about Guantanamo and so forth. And so a lot of belligerents are non-state actors. I think that you're going to debate a lot about cyber war. And so I think you, on the negative, can mount a defense of the idea that a lot of the principles of jus in bello, a lot of the Geneva Conventions, Well, they're from the late 40s, and war has changed since then. And if we are detaining at Guantanamo, and if we are detaining on secret evidence, it's because the intelligence involved in pinning down those threats, in finding the actors involved, that the enterprise is completely different from what it would have been in a previous generation. So, the United States does not have a moral obligation to adhere to jus in bello principles, because those jus in bello principles are outdated. They're based on old assumptions. They're based on two armies meeting on the battlefield, both lining up and pointing their muskets at each other, and that just isn't the way war works anymore. All right. So that's our groundbreaking. That is some things to think about on the affirmative, some angles, and then some possible starting points on the negative. And there will be more as we think of more, as you think of more and have ideas that you want to bat around. But you got a brand new topic. I think it is a reasonably good and coherent topic. I think it's a huge improvement over last year. Give it some thought. You got the summer stretching ahead of you to cook up good schemes, and best of luck to you.